Today is the third installment in my Women in Ministry series, and today we're going to be taking a look at some women who were church leaders in the early church that are mentioned in the Bible. And we're going to focus today on Romans chapter 16. This is a chapter where Paul basically just greets a bunch of people who he wants to say hello to, or in one case, whom he's sending the letter to the Romans with, actually. And in this chapter, we have at least two instances of women who were in a position of leadership and ministry in the early church, which I think is some really solid evidence that women were intended to serve in ministry along with men. So first, let's look at the first passage here, Romans 16, 1 through 2, which I will read to you. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church at Cenchreae, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and help her in whatever she may need from you. For she has been a patron of many and of myself as well. Now, I have to say, I'm usually pretty happy with the ESV translation. That's why I consistently read the ESV in my videos. This is a really bad translation right here, in particular the word servant, where it says Phoebe was a servant of the church. Servant is not at all the right word here. The word used here is deacon, and obviously a deacon in the church was someone who was in a leadership position and probably did some ministry. What it should say is, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church. That's what it says in the original Greek, and there's no reason to pretend that she wasn't a deacon. She was a deacon in the church. So, very unhappy with the translation here. And essentially, why this verse is significant is because we're seeing a woman who was in a position of leadership and ministry in the church. And if there were women in positions of ministry and leadership in the church back then it's likely that women can also serve in positions of leadership and ministry in the church today. It's also significant that Paul probably trusted Phoebe enough to actually bring the letter to the Romans to the Romans. She was like the bearer of this letter. And we know that that was probably the case because Paul urges them to welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints and help her in whatever she may need from you. Since he's telling them to welcome her, it's probable that she was the one who carried the letter to them. So Phoebe was a really significant woman in the early church. She was a deaconess, and she was trusted enough by Paul that she carried the letter to the Romans. So pretty impressive. Then we're going to look at verse 7. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and my fellow prisoners. They are well known to the apostles, and they were in Christ before me. Okay, so first of all, this is also not a very good translation of this verse, but I will get to that presently. The first thing here to look at is the name Junia. For a long time, this name typically appeared in the text as Junius, which would have been a man's name, but in the original biblical text, this is Junia, a female name, and Andronicus was probably Junia's husband. And now you may be thinking, well, why does that matter, Thetan? These are just some people mentioned in the Bible who were well known to the apostles. And well, the truth here is that they were not just well known to the apostles. The Greek here says that Andronicus and Junia were apostles. They were very significant ministers and founding members of the early church. They weren't just known to the apostles, they were among the apostles. So it's important to consider here what precisely the office of apostle was. Well, an apostle was a person who personally encountered the risen Jesus Christ and then was ordained or called by the risen Christ to serve in ministry in the early church. So if Junia and Andronicus were apostles, they were both specifically called to ministry in the early church, meaning that Junia was in ministry in the early church. And it's also worth noting that these people here aren't just apostles, they're very well respected apostles. Other translations say, I believe, revered apostles, which really gives gives the full gives the full meaning of this passage, that these were very well respected leaders in the early church. Basically, why I want to highlight this chapter and these 3 verses in this chapter in particular is because it shows that women did serve in ministry in the early church. We already looked at 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy 2, and I explained why I believe neither of those passages forbid women from serving in ministry. And if women are not forbidden to serve in ministry, then you would expect that we would see some women serving in ministry in the early church. And based on this passage, it looks like women in the early church did indeed serve in ministry. This has been a shorter video today. In my next one, I'm going to discuss some of the church tradition and history surrounding women in ministry, see what some of the early church fathers did and thought about women in ministry, which should be fascinating. Thank you for watching. Have a blessed day.